It's being called cash for curtains. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is facing a number of inquiries over who paid for an expensive refurbishment of his flat in Downing Street. It is a row about wallpaper and curtains, yes, but there are questions too about financial transparency and even corruption. This is Roundtable. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, hand clasped to forehead, denies breaking the rules about donations. Politicians are meant to declare them so the public can decide if the money's had any influence on their decisions. The flat in question is his residence in Downing Street, actually above number 11, not number 10. And the row has thrown up lots of questions, which will now be investigated by the UK's election watchdog and senior civil servants. But is corruption something that voters really care about? And I'm very pleased to say that we can welcome back to Roundtable Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. John, you've been in politics as long as I've been in journalism, which is to say for a good few years. Have you had time in the last week or so to reflect on whether this sort of issue does resonate with voters? Do they care about corruption?
I think the answer to that is it depends on the circumstances. It may also depend on the person. The word sleaze is essentially a product of the politics of the 1990s, when the then Conservative government under John Major undoubtedly came under continuous fire for both allegations of sexual indiscretion and also seemingly financial indiscretion as well. Now, the truth is that government was already pretty unpopular, but it set itself up for a fall because Sir John Major, the then Prime Minister, started talking about family values and the importance of adhering to them. And after that, there was a cascade of allegations, all of which suggested that Sir John Major's attempt to claim the moral high ground was not doing him any good. In contrast, it's worth bearing in mind that Boris Johnson has never set himself up as being more morally righteous than anybody else.
So therefore, do you think this will cut less with the voters than the John Major issue?
Yeah, because the point is it's not cutting across people's existing impressions of Boris Johnson. I mean, for the most part, he's already somebody who's got a fairly clear track record as somebody who is inclined to feel that the ends justifies the means. See, for example, above all, the row about the prorogation of Parliament back in September 2018. And in particular, amongst those who believe that Boris Johnson is doing the right thing, obviously with Brexit and now more recently with levelling up and handling the pandemic, you start looking at the polling data and you discover that, well, these folk, at least, for the time being at least, inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt.
And add into that, if I may say, something that you wrote some time ago resonated with me, and that is that probably only a third of people are at all interested in politics.
Oh, sure. I mean, in general, only a third of people are interested in politics, and the truth is only a third of people have been saying that they've been following this particular story at all closely. I mean, I think the one caveat I would have about all of this is that the one defense that Mr. Johnson doesn't have for whatever indiscretion may or may not have happened with respect to the funding of the number 11 flat is that, that was not something that was done in pursuit of some wider political project. But again, even there, we should remember, at the moment so far, we're talking about the Electoral Commission investigating financial activity by the Conservative Party. The truth is that the Electoral Commission has found all of our political parties guilty at various points in the past of failing to keep to the rules. And to that extent, at least, it'll be a case of let him be careful, he who casts the first stone.
John, I know you look at the figures, you study politics, but if you were a guessing man, a gambling man, what would you think the chances of this being seriously wounding, if not fatal, to Boris Johnson politically are?
Well, so far, at least it has to be said, it's not had any obvious impact on the government's popularity. It's got an 8-point lead in the polls, and it had an 8-point lead in the polls at the beginning of April, before any of these allegations were kicking around. One thing that people are saying, look, if it were to be clear that Boris Johnson lied about what he did or didn't say in a clearly rather intemperate meeting about trying to avoid a lockdown, then they are beginning to say, well, maybe that's not acceptable. But the truth is, at the moment, even there, Conservative voters at least are saying, well, look, when he was saying that, he's basically trying to say, like, I'm really, really keen to avoid a lockdown. And they don't necessarily feel that this is him being injudicious in his choice of language and being insensitive to those who've lost loved ones during the pandemic. So if Mr. Johnson can be demonstrated to be absolutely clearly have lied, maybe we'll have a problem. But of course, given it was a private meeting, unless somebody's got a tape recording, that might prove rather difficult to prove.
It's not necessarily the untruths that you, the politician yourself, tell. It's the untruths that other people put out about you in these situations. I'm thinking back to John Major wearing his shirt supposedly tucked into his underpants. That did not help his image. And I'm thinking here that the comment that's been attributed to him and his fiancée, not backed up by anything at the moment, that they were disparaging about a major store that would be aspirational for an awful lot of people in the UK when it came to the furnishings, that they denigrated this store. That might be very damaging.
Yeah, it won't do much for his image, and it was quite intriguing that Sir Keir Starmer was suddenly demonstrating an interest in the wallpaper offerings of John Lewis yesterday. Sure, there is always, I guess, a question that Boris Johnson has to worry about, is that he is somebody who has changed the character of support for the Conservative Party quite considerably. It's now as popular amongst working class voters as is the Labour Party, and then to that extent at least, he has to be careful about not coming across as the Bullingdon Club toff from Oxford, which of course is part of his background. But I guess in the end of the day, what will matter above all is whether or not he and his government are thought to be delivering what those who voted for him did. He certainly delivered Brexit. The question now is, will be able to deliver the post-pandemic Britain that people feel matches the promise that the government made about levelling up back in December 2019.
Always good to have you on the programme, Sir John Curtice, talking to us there from Glasgow. Appreciate it very much. Well, now we can welcome three more guests to this edition of Roundtable out of Cambridge in the UK. Andy Davey, political cartoonist. We go to Colchester in Essex and say hello to John Bartle, Professor of Government at the University of Essex and in Wiltshire. We see Peter Oborne, journalist and author of The Assault on Truth, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump and the Emergence of a New Moral Barbarism. Peter, first of all, you've described Downing Street as a moral cesspit. You say Boris Johnson is a habitual liar. He lies with impunity, without conscience. He is a charlatan. You may hold those views, but they don't seem to be resonating with the voters very much.
I don't agree with you. I have a faith in the British voters. They're decent people. They can discern the difference between truth and falsehood and right and wrong. I mean, in the book you've just very kindly mentioned, I have endless examples of Mr. Johnson's lies, and not in the few months it's been out and available, Downing Street has not come back to correct even a single dot or comma of the book. They can't rebut this, they just carry on, and you get new lies every week. In my view, this is unsustainable. You can't have a sort of effectively a fantasy narrative now inside Downing Street, and the real world out there goes on the basis of empirical truth. Something's going to come apart, and you're already seeing that happen, for instance, in Northern Ireland, where they said there would be no consequences for trade from Brexit, and of course we're seeing terrible consequences.
I want to put this to you. It was a question you asked in your book, I believe. Why is power nowadays going to these clownish entertainers with no morals?
I think it's an indication of how deeply unserious our politics has become. that you can do and say things and behave in a way which would have been unthinkable even maybe 10 years ago. And I try to trace the process in our book. A big moment was Tony Blair and weapons of mass destruction. Britain used the existence of Saddam Hussein's WMD as a reason to go for war. And of course, there weren't any. And the fact there were never any consequences for that, either for the British Prime Minister, or indeed for the spy chiefs who concocted the fabricated dossier, sent a strange message, a terrible message out about the readiness or the acceptability of lying. I think also, and then you have Boris Johnson comes along, and he models himself, I think, or is it part of the same manifestation of Trump, which takes Blair's lies onto a new dimension of really where you can say anything you like. You create an entirely separate fantasy world, which was okay, in the world of satire or the world of comedy or TV, but it is not. It's new at the highest level of government in, first of all, the United States.
Peter, hold that thought, if you wouldn't mind, for just a moment, because I want to come back to you on whether lying is actually new in politics. You wrote The Rise of Political Lying. We'll come to that in just a moment. But John Bartle from the University of Essex, let's have a listen to what Boris Johnson said when challenged about this issue.
I don't think that this is the number one issue for the people of our country. Indeed, by several orders of magnitude. Several orders of magnitude, I would say what people want the government to focus on now, which is exactly what we're doing.
You have made
is
that
on
point.
Education,
change of subject,
crime, and all the other issues that really matter.
Boris Johnson there suggesting that people really don't care about this sort of thing.
I think there are two responses to that proposition. The first is that clearly they should be concerned about whether or not their politicians are honest and have integrity. But the sad empirical fact is that most ordinary voters are not terribly concerned in what they see as the detail and minutiae of Westminster politics. Although you and I may be quite taken aback by the failure of the Prime Minister to come clean about the sources of funding, it is not an issue that generally alarms voters out there. It is not, I think, an issue which they are overly concerned. They tend to be quite cynical in their approach to politicians. Nevertheless,
and is this what Boris Johnson is relying on here? I was talking to John Curtice earlier on, and he said, look, only a third of people are interested in politics anyway. Is this what Boris Johnson is banking on, that it just doesn't matter to people?
I think that Boris Johnson has great experience of dealing with the public. He's had a lot of interactions during his time, not just as the Prime Minister, but as London Mayor. And he knows something about the nature of the British voter, about their preparedness to spend time learning the details of the way that the system works. And he does know that they're not prepared to go into the great detail. I think what many people view this as is a relatively legalistic issue, and one that is not terribly important. Those of us who study this know that the rule of law is of tremendous importance, and if we don't follow it now, it will have tremendous systemic consequences going forward. But if you're a voter who takes a rather casual interest in politics, and often views politics not just simply as a serious business of delivering on the people's preferences, but as a form of entertainment, Boris Johnson's discovered a new way of escaping liability for actions which 10, 15, 20 years ago may have caused him very, very serious problems, as he lost his reputation amongst the senior members in his party.
OK, John, back with you in just a moment. Let's come to Andy Davey, political cartoonist, and your work's been in national, international newspapers on and off for years. Let's take a look at the very first one that we have chosen of you with Boris Johnson. Round a cabinet table saying friends, and clearly there are none, papers flying everywhere, leaks, polls, sleaze. Before I get into one detail on that, I want to ask you, do you think political cartoons are influential in this process?
Well, it appears that they're less influential than they used to be in the UK. But it's interesting that politicians still take an interest in political cartoons. They still take them seriously, in inverted commas, but they're always more important in countries that have less of a rule of law, more like dictatorships or something approaching a dictatorship. The cartoons there and visual images generally are very important. Take, for example, the Arab Spring uprisings across North Africa. They often used cartoon banners to get their ideas across rather than the printed word, because images go directly to your emotions rather than your intellect.
Mm. Well, let's move on to the next one that we're going to show our viewers. A big lorry, like a cement lorry. You can see what's coming out of the back. Leave it to your imagination. Let it rip. What were you trying to say here?
Well, it was the day when it was revealed that he'd said "let it rip" last autumn, I think it was, when he was talking about the second lockdown, and he wanted to let it rip, let the coronavirus let rip through the population. This was another quote separate from his quote about letting bodies pile high, rather let bodies pile high than have a third lockdown. And so I thought, well, let it rip, let's let it rip on Johnson, because to my mind, he deserves it. All that whole.
Do you think the ability to be able to laugh with a cartoonist is more hurtful to a politician than perhaps the acres of newsprint, the words that are put out by serious political columnists?
Yeah, I mean, there are many people who, the old adage of, an image in 1,000 words, and that's been said many times over. And it is, there's a reason they're still in the papers, because they do convey an image of the government without people having to read through acres of text. And as John said, people aren't, first Curtice said, I think, was it, that only a third of people are interested in politics anyway. So trying to get through to people who aren't interested the way to do it is not through long tracts of, polysyllabic text.
It's that smash on the chin, isn't it? You can see it instantly, even though you may not feel it coming.
Well, we hope so as cartoonists. I think we're whistling in the dark because we suspect that they're losing their relevance in the kind of multimedia age. But we always, when we get together, always say that, that these things are important.
Okay, Andy, hold on to that. We'll look at some more of your artwork in just a moment. Peter Oborne, back to you. The rise of political lying. When did it start?
Well, in one sense, it's always been with us. I think Jonathan Swift wrote a pamphlet, The Art of Political Lying, 200 more years ago. Machiavelli wrote about it in The Prince, Plato. And in fact, I think I was instructed by the current Prime Minister on the noble lie. I mean, in a philosophical kind of way, when I wrote that book, because I worked at The Spectator at the time. And so there's nothing.
When he was the editor of that magazine?
Oh, when he was editor of the Spectator.
Yeah.
But and that noble lie is, of course, that there are high justifications for lying, which is an important part of the of progressive belief. The Marxist view that the end justifies the means. You can abuse due process, and you can just think of the terrible lies of the 20th century, from Stalin to Mao, and the 21st century.
So can I ask you this? What makes you so strong in your objections to Boris Johnson as a Prime Minister, when this kind of conduct has been going on for centuries, probably since the beginning of time? Why do you find him particularly unpleasant?
I wrote both books as a British citizen, concerned British citizen. In the Middle East and in autocratic situations, lying is normal. Of course, dictators lie. Orwell's very strong on this. But in Britain, for nearly 200 years really now, we've had a constitutional agreement that you shouldn't lie in Parliament. And of course, the rule of law, which Professor Bartle was referring to. You can't lie in commerce, in your private, your business dealings. You'll get sent. You can't perjure yourself in court. You'll go to jail for that, as Jonathan Aitken discovered in the last Tory government in the late 90s. So there's been a convention that you don't lie, and that is what is being smashed. It was one of the unique things.
Let's go to John Bartle, if I may, because you did write, I came across this just before the programme, you wrote that truth remains highly valued in British society. Still?
Yes, it is in general. But I'd like to pick up one of the points that Peter's made. I mean, it's interesting to go back to that period just before Brexit and the general election of 2019, when Mr. Johnson actually sent his advisors off to Her Majesty the Queen to advise her to prorogue Parliament. Now, it was very clear that when the Supreme Court, the former House of Lords, gave judgment, it was very clear that many of the most senior judges in the land really felt that Mr. Johnson had led his advisors to mislead Her Majesty the Queen. Now, if we have a Prime Minister who is capable of doing that and getting away with it, then we've reached a very different place to where we were in the 1960s and 1970s. I think the reasons for these changes are multiple, but I think one of the real reasons is that we have a leader of a political party who really understands the way that the media work and the way that the media operates in relation to public opinion. And I think what this buys into is a Hollywood view of the world in which lawyers are essentially scoring points rather than effecting justice. I think the people, ordinary voters...
Rather nicely, John, if I may interrupt, to one of Andy's cartoons, the one at the Oscars, showing Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, his former advisor, who's now being so vituperative about the Prime Minister. What were you trying to say here? That these are essentially children fighting over something? That it's not taken by them seriously?
In the cartoon, no, it was Oscars Day, of course, and Johnson had said something like it was an ID parade or something like that. I've forgotten the actual quote now, but there was something on the very day of the Oscars that he was talking about an ID parade, and it struck me that he was obviously trying to nail Cummings for all the leaks, and it struck me that, well, he's trying to push the blame onto Cummings for something which is really all his fault. And it was ironic that he was trying to blame Cummings for something where the blame for all of this sleaze lies at Johnson's door.
Andy, we're going to end the programme with another one featuring Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson. As we go out, I'd just like you to tell us what that is. But Peter, let me come back to you. Do you believe that this could be the end of Johnson's current political career?
Yes, I do. I think that if he turns out to have lied to the House of Commons on the matter of this quote-unquote COVID, there is a convention you don't lie to the House of Commons. And the Prime Minister, it were to be proved that he had made these terrible remarks about bodies piling up, I think it'd be hard for him to survive. The key thing, of course, is a vote. He has a majority, but of 80. If Tory MPs were disgusted by his behaviour, he couldn't last.
OK, John, same question to you, and then back to Andy for the end. Do you think he'll last?
I think it's right. I think the question about the funding of the renovations at Downing Street is far less important than the alleged remarks that he's made about the lockdown, because that really will strike people very, very close in their hearts. Many people have been touched by the COVID crisis. And if that can be demonstrated to be correct, then I think he is in a very, very vulnerable situation.
OK. Andy, First World War, Second World War, I can't tell by looking at this, but they're certainly in the trenches, and somebody's screaming out to Private Johnson or Captain Johnson, watch out, sir, high explosive DOMs. Meaning what?
It's just a bad cartoonist's pun, of course. We can lower ourselves to cheap puns just like anybody else. Explosive bombs, of course, but Dominic Cummings was it seemed to be releasing new bits of information through the day, and they were leaked out sequentially. So it seemed to me that these were explosive bombs that were launched at this rather atavistic character that runs our country.
Same question to you that I put to Peter and to John. Do you think this could prove politically fatal, if only for the time being, for Boris Johnson?
I'm really emboldened that Peter and John both have such faith in the judgment of the electorate, which, you know, doesn't seem to be borne out in Sir John Curtice's research, or the YouGov research today, which showed, ironically, that the Conservatives had gained a point, and yet 60% of voters believed that the Tory party was very sleazy or something quite damning, but they were quite happy for the party to be that way.
I just want to leave you with this thought, bearing in mind what you've just said. And in 2019, shortly before Johnson became Tory leader, the Hansard Society, that being so closely related to the British Parliament, found that 54%, more than half of the electorate, believed that Britain needed a strong leader who is willing to break the rules. Perhaps that's what the United Kingdom has, for the time being, at least. Thank you very much indeed to my guests on this programme, and thank you very much wherever you happen to be watching it. We hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.